Hi, I'm Dr. Blunt, academic, philosopher, lover of sweet treats. Today I'm going to talk to you about when you can act on your right to resistance, and I'm going to do so by talking about this cinnamon roll. So let's say you go out and you buy a delicious cinnamon roll and you're really looking forward to eating it, and you go into your kitchen and what's this? Oh me, oh my, someone else is going to eat it.
Oh, is this yours?
So let me explain property rights to you. As John Locke says in the Second Treatise of Government, when you mix your labor with something, it belongs to you. You can see by Robert Nozick's argument in Anarchy, State, and Utopia that by taking my property, you are effectively enslaving me. And you don't want to enslave me, do you?
Interesting, cogent, and absolutely not boring, but I don't care.
I am going to call the police, and they are going to stop you from stealing my property.
The cops? I own the cops. This is my town. All my pastry crime is overlooked. You're screaming madness into the void.
Okay, so what should we take away from this over-elaborate excuse for me to eat a cinnamon roll? Well, the first thing you need to understand is that the right to resistance, you can't just come out swinging. Certain conditions have to be met. Now, where there's debate is over what those conditions actually are. And this is, in fact, a pretty big problem when we're talking about the right to resistance. If we go back to Jeremy Bentham, he wrote a scathing critique of natural rights, especially the right to resistance. He said this: "Whenever you are about to be oppressed, you have the right to resist oppression. Whenever you conceive yourself to be oppressed, conceive yourself to have a right to make resistance and act accordingly. In proportion as a law of any kind, any act of power, supreme or subordinate, legislative, administrative, or judicial, is unpleasant to a man, especially if, in consideration of such its unpleasantness, his opinion is that such an act of power ought not to have been exercised, he, of course, looks upon it as oppression. As often as anything of this sort happens to a man, as often as anything happens to a man to inflame his passions, this article, for fear his passions should not sufficiently be inflamed of themselves, sets itself to work to blow the flame, urges him to resistance. Submit not to any decree or other act of power, of the justice of which you yourself are not perfectly convinced. If a constable calls upon you to serve in the militia, shoot the constable and not the enemy. If the commander of a press gang trouble you, push him into the sea. If a bailiff, throw him out the window. If a judge sentence you to be imprisoned or put to death, have a dagger ready and take a stroke first at the judge." The point Bentham's making here is that if the simple perception or feeling of oppression is sufficient to enact the right of resistance, then we are on a slip and slide straight into Hobbesian anarchy, the war of all against all. Because whenever I feel my rights are slighted, then I am justified to sharpen that knife and go set upon the judge. And that is anarchy, straight up anarchy, and no one wants that. So the right of resistance doesn't seem like a right at all to Bentham. Now, fortunately, we have something to say to Mr. Bentham on the right of resistance. The first thing that we can say to him is this: he's making a big conflation of two things, law and power. For Bentham, it simply seems like saying that you have the power to enforce the law is sufficient, and he's a legal positivist, so it's kind of understandable. But most people think that there needs to be something more. That when the cop tries to stop you in the street or the judge sentences you to go to prison, that they are reflecting a more legitimate form of power, right? And this is the difference between law and simple naked power. There has to be something differentiating them. Otherwise, there would be no difference between a cop on one hand and a mugger on the other. Now, the cop is supposed to reflect the legitimate authority of the state, whereas the mugger is simply the naked power of coercion. Now, perhaps a legal positivist is going to say, well, there really is no difference, but I happen to think that there is a distinct thing between non-arbitrary law and arbitrary power. Secondly, Bentham has built a huge straw man, right? Like, this is a Wicker Man style straw man that he is trying to shove the right of resistance in to set on fire, right? If you read anyone who writes on the right of resistance, no one's just like, if you feel oppressed, then you have the right to burn this motherfucker down. No one says that. You read your James Harrington, you read your John Locke, you read your Thomas Jefferson. They all say that certain conditions have to be met before you can legitimately enact your right to resistance. And you know what, my dear friends? In that stupid clip at the beginning of the video, I went through them. I asserted a property right. I reasoned about my property right. I appealed to institutions, and only when all of those failed, the Kill Bill siren comes on. Now you might say, oh, Dr. Blunt, I can see you made those conditions, but I don't think stealing a pastry is sufficient to go full Kill Bill. And you know what? You would be absolutely correct. So the real question is, when is something sufficient to trigger those processes of resistance? Oftentimes, I feel like people want philosophy to do more than it can, right? Like, you want to sort of write down, a certain algorithm and then send it out into like a data processing unit that will come back and say the right thing to do is X. And more often than not, philosophy doesn't really do that. Philosophy provides us with the tools that ease what Rawls called the burdens of judgment, right? It provides us with a way of approaching difficult moral problems that we then have to rely on our own brains to interpret. So when Bentham says something like, oh, how do you know that something is really bad? What's the criterion? You can't give me a specific one, well, therefore the right doesn't exist. I don't buy that, because that's not how ethics work. The only reason why Bentham thought ethics worked that way is because he was a crazy utilitarian. But I digress. I'm not going to rag on utilitarians. I'm just saying that expecting philosophy to produce outcomes that are comparable to a mathematical or a chemical formula, it's not realistic. It's not what philosophy is supposed to do. So when I was writing my book, I started thinking about, okay, what justifies the right to resistance? And I didn't want to rely on natural rights theory, because that's not the sort of approach that I have to political philosophy. I'm what generally gets called a practice-dependent theorist. I'm interested in actually existing social practices, social structures, and thinking about what the optimal norm for governing them would be. This is derived from sort of, post-World War II liberalism and republicanism sort of made this. Republicanism. So I looked at the international system, the one that evolved after the Second World War, in the aftermath of the Holocaust and the aftermath of Nazi atrocities. And there was this idea that under certain conditions, the international community can hold states to account for their internal practices. And this is a big deal, right? Because the basic principle governing the international system is state sovereignty. So saying that there are certain times where the state isn't sovereign is a big change in the practices of the international system. So what triggers this intervention? Well, generally speaking, there are two things: genocide and crimes against humanity. In these instances, the international community, if you read Responsibility to Protect, has an obligation to intervene to stop these atrocities from happening. These are the crimes that shock the conscience of humanity. So the question that I had in my mind is like, okay, if this enables external actors to intervene, then does it allow internal actors to overthrow the state? And to me, I was just like, yeah, that's obviously true. If the people subjected to the power didn't have this right, then the external actors wouldn't have the right either. Then the big question: is global poverty like genocide or like a crime against humanity? And if you want to answer to that question, well, you're going to have to tune into the next video. Take care, everyone. And thanks for watching the video and dealing with my stupid skits and voices and bullshits, because I like my stupid skits and sketches and bullshits. It's how I keep myself busy on the weekends. All right. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.